This is the Keys to the Kingdom podcast, where we explore how the psychedelic renaissance becomes accessible to everyone. I'm your host, Tammy Sanders, and I'm glad you're with us. Thanks so much for listening. In this episode, we chat with Mohawk, a Brooklyn-based advocate and activist for ending the war on drugs. This includes working for nearly 10 years to destigmatize drugs, reduce drug-related harm and risk, and educate on responsible drug use. Raised in a relatively substance-free home by parents who didn't even drink coffee, Mohawk has a productive life that incorporates drugs as a joyful, fulfilling, and expansive experience. Mohawk's keys are drug decriminalization, legalization, and regulation. If you want to use psychedelics or other psychoactive substances to enhance and advance your life, Mohawk wants your drugs to be of reliable quality and readily available. In this conversation, during which I interrupt a lot with questions, Mohawk lays it down about why drug laws don't keep us safe, why kids should learn about drugs, and why we might want to reconsider how we think about cocaine. Mohawk, thanks so much for joining us. Really great to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Now, before we get started on the topic at hand, we'll be talking about decriminalization and various topics related to that. I'm wondering if you can just situate yourself for us a bit in psychedelics, professionally, personally. How did you come to psychedelics?
So basically, psychedelics were not really. I didn't have a huge understanding of most substances, with my exposure to them growing up. But I knew that psychedelics were around. I didn't really, gravitate towards them until I became like really, really kind of like deep into party and rave kind of settings.
Mm-hmm.
So my first exposure, yeah, I guess technically my first exposure would have been MDMA,
Mm-hmm.
because that's a very common drug used in party scenes like rave scenes where there's music and dancing,
Mm-hmm.
and that type of setting. And so kind of with experimenting with that opened me up to different types of substances. So I would say that it took away a lot of the fear that I had around using, quote unquote, like hard drugs, which,
Mm-hmm.
people would consider it because they're illegal and there's so much anti-drug propaganda around anything that's illegal,
Mm-hmm.
or, scheduled 1 and 2.
Actually,
So it took
actually,
away.
actually, wait. Actually, before we go on, I just wanted to say a little bit because folks might not be familiar with the language. What do you mean by Schedule 1 and 2?
If anyone were to go look up what's in the scheduled um, categories, in Schedule 1, you have things, for example, MDMA, LSD, heroin, cannabis, marijuana. Schedule 2, it's like there are some medical uses, but it still might be in the category of high abuse potential. So cocaine is in that schedule, and I believe methamphetamine falls into that schedule as well, only because in rare occasions you might actually have some medicinal use of those two um, types of substances. But it's like it's very arbitrary.
Is alcohol in any of the scheduling?
Alcohol is not scheduled at all.
Even though people can become addicted to it and can abuse it?
Yeah. So,
Interesting. Okay.
like I said, it's completely arbitrary because anyone who uses something like LSD, magic mushrooms, even MDMA, or these things are Schedule 1, like maybe there can be some sort of like psychological addiction to many of them, but like I don't know about you, but every time I'm doing psychedelics, I'm just like, "Ooh, here we go!" Like this is
Uh,
gonna be
uh,
a ride. Like it's not like
yeah.
I'm itching for psychedelics in the morning and on
No,
my
no,
lunch
no.
break and before
No, no,
bed,
no, no, no.
like
No, it's no, I
like
do, I definitely do not think of when's the next time I can come completely out of my body and then float around and feel all my molecules. Because that's awesome. No, 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 no,
yeah.
no.
Well,
No, not at all.
apparently, according to our, very unusual and discriminatory scheduling system, they suggest that those types of chemicals have high abuse potential.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah. That essentially
there's no
this
reason trying to make sense of it because it's clearly biased.
I think that that's the point, right? So as I was listening to you, or it's kind of like you're kind of going here and then you're going there, and where we end up is this may not necessarily be the scheduling of drugs may not necessarily be something that actually is sensible or sensical. So you could tell us what the scheduling is, but that doesn't mean we actually will really understand it. And
Right.
the scheduling, just to be clear, is federal U.S. federal government scheduling. U.S. federal government decisions about which drugs are legal, which drugs have medicinal use, which drugs don't, which drugs are dangerous, etc. So it even though it's formal and it's governmental, that doesn't necessarily mean it's sensible or sensical.
Right. And there's
Yeah.
like a few ways, if we have time or interest, to discuss like kind of like getting away from that really arbitrary scheduling system. Especially if there's a lot of movements to decriminalize psychedelics or legalize the medicinal use of certain psychedelics like MDMA is well on its way, psilocybin is well on its way. Um, in some areas, it's been decriminalized already, especially plant psychedelics. But there's a few ways that we can, I guess, work with our system to try to get these things scheduled. Um, so basically, we know that the president does hold the power to be like, yeah, we're rescheduling this, or we're removing this from the schedule entirely. There can be some sort of amendment made that basically um, uses like our executive branch and our legislative branches to federally get these things like off the scheduling system or rescheduled.
Well, hold on. So hold on 1 second. This is actually very interesting, and this sort of just dives us right into the conversation. And I'm good with that. We can come back to other things in just a moment. But so I did not know this, that the president can, by executive order, criminalize or uncriminalize drugs.
Basically, yes. They're
Interesting.
not going to, so we might as well just skip on over. There's
You never know. You never know. I mean, it would be
maybe if
interesting
we
to have.
had elected like Ralph Nader in 1996 or whatever, we would have had that happen. But
Yeah, well, you never know though. I mean, you end up with your first president who's had a psychedelic experience. You never know.
yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, I think that would not go over so well. It's one of those things that the president would have to do like on their way out of office, to be like,
Mm-hmm.
um, just being like, fuck it, we're sending it, like just
Yeah.
executive
Yeah.
order, executive order,
It's my
executive
it's my
order.
last 48 hours. I'm out of here. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so either the president can be like, hey, we're just doing it, executive order. They do it all the time, especially when they find ways around going through the rigorous process of figuring out if something, like how something should be scheduled. And they can do like
Yeah.
those emergency scheduling where it's like, oh no, 3 people died. This is a danger to society. Now we're just going to do this emergency scheduling while we figure out whether or not we want to like change the scheduling of it.
Yeah.
A lot of times they just say, this is too close to this other drug we've already scheduled.
Mm.
And we have a blanket law that basically is called the Analog Act, I believe, where if it's kind of like remotely similar in like preparation or molecular structure, like um, and like effects, they could say, oh, this is very closely resembles MDMA or
Yeah.
something that's Schedule 1. So that means that's also Schedule 1. That is
Okay.
so vague. Like you could
Yeah.
get away with calling everything, oh, this is MDMA like or
Yeah.
LSD like
Yeah. This
or
vaguely resembles some
opioid
other.
like.
Yeah. This vaguely resembles some other drug. So we should put this. We should schedule this drug and make it essentially make it illegal.
Yeah, so that's what
Yeah.
happens a lot. And that's why, for some people who are aware that we have so many weird, you know, novel psychoactive substances, as they call them, it's like just popping up, like random stuff we don't know about, just because folks who are creating these illicit market substances are just trying to get around the laws. So they're like,
Yeah,
well, we'll
gotcha.
tweak it a little bit, make it something that's too new for there to be legislation around it, and circulate that until law enforcement picks up on this.
Yeah.
And then when
It
they
seems,
do, they ban that. It's like a game of whack-a-mole. They're
yeah,
like, well, we'll just tweak it some more, and just now it's got an extra, molecule and looks. It's just,
yeah.
it's a pretty chaotic system right now. And
It
then
seems,
also,
it also seems though too, like that's how you actually end up injecting danger into, like, into the system, right? That, folks can essentially uh handcraft these, handcraft drugs that are just slightly off from, a drug that you might think you recognize or might think you know about. And so you're ingesting something that is supposed to be like something else, but it's just different enough to introduce some new risk that you otherwise don't know about. So it's interesting because I think these laws are, well, I'm not going to speak to people's, to sort of people's intentions, but there's the supposition that the law is there to keep us safe. And yet it does seem that there are several facets in which the law actually exposes us to more risk and danger.
yes, exactly. Basically we've gone from substances that we have some research around, even if the research suggests that, oh, there's these high risks, at least we know that those high risks exist. We know what chemicals are, extremely physically addicting.
Mhm.
And even if they are, we know how to navigate that. If someone's in withdrawal from an opioid, or a benzo, it's like, okay, we know these are dangerous and this is how this can be treated, X, Y, and Z. So basically, it creates, no one's going to stop using substances just because someone said you can't do this anymore. Maybe that will deter some people, but unfortunately, like once you get a taste, sometimes get into using these substances, you don't care.
Yeah.
And I'm like,
Yeah.
not even from like a standpoint of you're addicted to it. It's because it's like this is nowhere near how it was described to me in the DARE program, or
Yeah. Yeah.
from Nancy Reagan, like these one hit and you're hooked things. It was like, or like they show you some person who's just like, I don't know, they make him look like paint a drug user to look like the most awful person on the planet.
Yeah. Your life has just
Like
come
your life
apart.
is just gonna, yeah, go to shambles. And it's like,
Yeah.
well, a lot of us are using drugs and we've got, we're gainfully employed. Some people are great parents and
Hmm.
all these things. But yeah, basically like over legislating this in a way that makes it even more difficult to regulate and understand what the substances are doing is causing more harm
Yeah.
to people who are even trying to enjoy the things that actually aren't that harmful in the grand scheme of things. There's people who are, let's say, for example, trying to use something like LSD, but there might be other things that are being misrepresented as LSD that
Hmm.
you might not want to take 3 or 4 hits
Yes,
of, which
exactly.
would maybe be fine for you with the LSD,
Yeah.
but not if it's, for example, like 25I Inbohm, which is like a whole other class of drug, and could be far more dangerous. And people have definitely died from ingesting things of that nature. And maybe you were just trying to unpack some trauma,
Yeah,
like
exactly.
you weren't
Exactly.
trying to do
Yeah.
anything wild. You were trying to heal yourself and ended up with a bad batch or a
Yeah.
misrepresented chemical, and
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know
Yeah.
um,
Understand that. Understand that.
had a very negative experience or even a deadly one.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting too, because, I will say for me, the first that I heard of LSD, I didn't decide that I didn't want to use LSD because it was illegal. That never crossed my mind. I was like, I'm not using LSD because that sounds crazy. And I didn't know anything about it. And, the only information that I ever got about it was, someone's bad trip. So it is interesting because I do think that people's experience, and shared experience has, as maybe as much weight, if not more so, on people's decisions about drug use. And so if we could actually craft and share experience that's actually productive and positive, we might actually instigate productive and positive drug use way more than laws or regulations would.
Right. And that's something I'll definitely kind of go more in depth with. So, we know that the president can sign an executive order. Congress can also pass laws around it, but you've got 400 whatever folks being very useless right now. So again, an option that's probably not realistic in the current administration.
I'm not gonna argue with you about that. Let's just move on.
If I'm offending anybody out there, come talk to me. I have lots of opinions.
Just go talk to Mohawk. This is not a political conversation. This is a conversation about psychedelics access, and we're trying to figure out.
The reality is we don't have access because, hey, people are just dragging their feet on this. It's been proven time and time again, but unfortunately, not everyone can agree. Some people are rooted in the stigma, perpetuating that. But yeah, those are two ways. You could sign petitions because if you reach a certain level of signatures and stuff, at some point the White House has to review it. That is a route we have gone with other things like there's the Rave Act, which is a unique piece of legislation in the United States that basically, and this is more related to kind of like bars, clubs, venues, nightlife spaces, businesses, that basically tries to say, hey, if you seem like you're condoning drug use in your space, like in this place of business, then basically you're going to be regulated like you are running a crack house. Like it's literally an expansion off this law that we have called the crack house law that they don't want people congregating doing drugs. Gotcha. So that's why we have lots of things going on.
So it's to prevent people from congregating and engaging in drug use.
At least that's their that's how they think that works.
Okay. And by they you essentially mean lawmakers, lawmakers and law enforcement.
Yes. So there's not really been much, the law's not really been used to prosecute anybody, but it's still there and it instills fear in venue owners, particularly because people use drugs at parties. People use drugs in not even just parties, like what if there is an integration circle or something, people are kind of congregating to have healing experiences. Like any of those things could end up if somebody wanted to make an issue of it,
so like a rave party and a healing circle would be treated exactly the same.
Yeah, if they wanted to use that law to do so. And that law, by the way, was it was written by Joe Biden, unfortunately, in like 2004, and he like snuck it in with the Amber Alert, which is obviously has nothing to do with anything like drug use related, and was able to like pass it as like some sort of like, some sort of wave of other political thing they were doing, like a legislating thing they were doing. Nobody wanted to pass that law, but he snuck it in with something that had to do with children, which is what they do a lot, by the way, if people are not aware. They always find a way to make something about children, and then it just like sweeping votes for, whatever that is.
I mean, come on, Mohawk, who's not going to vote to protect the children? What kind of monster are you? Of course we're going to protect the children.
Children should be on drugs. No, I'm just kidding.
Oh my God.
Parents should allowed to be to do drugs.
Let me actually come back to that. So did you?
I'm joking, but sort of not.
Well, because honestly, you're not. Like you really aren't. So let's talk about that for reals. Let's talk about that. So did you grow up with parents who were involved in drugs? Did you grow up knowing people who were involved in drugs? Like how do you get to your evolution or your shift in perspective around engagement with substances for people young and old?
It's an interesting journey. My parents both did not touch any substances, at least
like
not
no alcohol, no cigarettes,
no alcohol, no nicotine. They weren't even prescribed anything, I mean, unless you want to sugar, like sweets, if you want to like go towards kind of like natural substances. They don't even drink coffee, energy drinks, no caffeine. So
Who
both
are
my
these
parents
people?
were,
Who raised
I think
you?
they're
Like,
people that honestly would benefit from psychedelics, but you know, that's another conversation.
okay.
But they, you know, different lifestyles. My dad
Yeah.
is from Memphis, Tennessee, from like a low income family, and
Yeah.
you know, parents who didn't get through school at all. I think
Yeah.
my grandfather had third grade education, and my grandmother was maybe 17, or sorry, seventh grade education. So,
Yeah.
you know, just
Yeah.
like sort of like that's end of the spectrum. And then my mom comes from a very educated family. Grandfather, you know, my grandfather was a college professor and a local politician, and the mother was, you know, my grandmother was a like a high school teacher, I believe, or some other academia. So you
Opposites
know,
attract, girl.
complete
Opposites
two
attract.
two completely opposite folks, but both of them were, you know, at least in my lifetime, you know, I don't know what they were doing as teenagers or young adults, but in my lifetime, they never used substances.
Yeah.
So the only substance use that I witnessed out, like, you know, in my family or in my community, were my cousins on my dad's side. You know, some of
Mm-hmm.
my dad's sisters and their sons, and they were still living in Memphis, which to this day is not a very, you know, economically sound place to be. So a
Yeah.
lot of people are
Yeah.
still kind of, you know, hustling out there.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so they were, as far as I'm aware, involved in cocaine selling. I don't know if they used it. If they
Mm-hmm.
did, it's not something that a 7-year-old would really like understand what's going on. But, you know, I was aware that they were selling cocaine for sure. They were in and out of prison. There were photographs of it hidden in my grandmother's closet. I don't know why. I don't know why they thought that was a good idea. Just little photographs of bricks of cocaine and just
Yeah.
weird stuff.
Yeah.
You know,
I
which
I just we just need to let it lie. You know, it's hard to understand what the
that's just
heck people are thinking.
incriminating information. I don't know. I
Yeah.
guess it was kind of like the 90s version of the selfie now, of like, you know,
Exactly.
flashing a wad
Ex-
of money or something
exactly.
like.
That that was your bling, your picture of your cocaine bricks. That was your bling. Yep.
So I was aware of that much going on, but I wasn't really in direct contact with um, a lot of that type of use. And my uncle and my grandfather drank a little bit here and there. My grandfather
Mm-hmm.
also smoked, on my mom's side, my grandfather also smoked cigarettes, almost till his death, which was unfortunately due to lung cancer or
Mm.
lung cancer related complications. So
Yeah.
that was it. I, you know, grew up around people who sort of did some things, and I
Yeah.
left it alone. Didn't seem to appeal to me until I got to college, and you know, I started drinking and realizing, oh, this is why people find this enjoyable. Like,
Yeah.
it changes your perspective and it changes your behavior in ways that maybe are pleasurable for you. You know, especially if you
And
have
sometimes
social anxiety or something
yeah.
like that.
Yeah, sometimes freeing, right? It can just
Yeah.
it can be a little bit freeing for you. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, as far as I'm aware, my brother, I have an older brother who's 6 years older than me. As far as I'm aware, he had dabbled in some things in high school too, but he was much older than me, so I didn't know what he was doing in his
Hmm.
private life with his friends while I'm at home or in school. You
Yeah.
know, I didn't understand any of that until I was much older, you know, and basically already also doing it. So
Yeah.
it's
Now,
interesting that it basically took me doing drugs to be like, wow, okay, this makes, like, no one told me about any of this. I had this all wrong. You know, didn't I had friends who did it in school and stuff, like whether it was weed or LSD or um, pharmaceuticals and stuff. It wasn't until I started to experiment with things that I was able to be like, this is nowhere near what they told us it was, and you know, let me do some research and reformulate my opinions around this.
yeah. So it sounds like drug use became part of your drug education, and it actually needed to become part of your drug education because it was sort of maybe like, so the clearest data point for you, like drug use actually provided some of the clearest data points for you, some of the most reliable data points for what drugs should or could mean to you.
Right.
Yeah. I do
Yeah,
have to
it's
say,
I'm an
I'm sorry. Go.
intuitive person, so I was just gonna say that basically it's like by the time I started experimenting a lot with substances, I was, especially like we were talking about the different contaminations and misrepresentations of substances, got to a point where it's like I'm doing different things I'm thinking are the same, and they were not. They felt different, and I'd be like, why is that? And so I'm a person who's going to just start Googling around trying to find answers if no one's telling me.
Mhm.
So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Now I will say, I've said this before on this podcast. I don't understand how you were standing up when you did MDMA, because the 3 MDMA journeys I had, I mean, I couldn't even get myself to the bathroom, like,
Oh no.
for like 6 hours, like because I wasn't in my body. So I just don't
How high
understand.
of a dose of MDMA were you on?
Well, I was on a journey dose. I was
Okay.
on a dose that was intended to, sort of really move me along. So it was definitely, I was not microdosing. It was definitely big dose. Um, and and
Yeah.
and the reason for that is because, I was taking MDMA specifically for healing. I was taking MDMA to um, push me to go in and investigate, my trauma, and break it apart and examine it, and decide, what to do with this, what to make of this. So, I definitely was taking doses that were quite significant, but I can also imagine that, there are folks at raves taking quite significant doses. And I really don't know, like, how you listen to like music and, like, walk around and touch people like that. That for me is just, so I do think too, it's interesting to just keep in mind too, that one person's experience is not everybody's experience. And
Right.
it's important, I think, to, if you are going to be curious about this, to get as much information as you can from others, get as much information as you can from reading. But then also, there's a degree to which you're going to have your own experience, mine that experience, and trust that experience.
Yeah, and there's definitely different ways that you could, like you said, you were taking basically a therapeutic dose, like you
Mm-hmm.
wanted to be out of your body.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Most people who are trying to party on the substance, I mean, there were a few times where like I took doses so high I couldn't get out of the seat. I would probably roll around on the floor a little bit, like I felt very jello-y, and
Yeah.
I wasn't up and dancing to the music. But there, once I kind of like understood how certain dosages and whatnot impacted my ability to make the most of the drug in that setting, then it was like, oh, maybe I shouldn't take 200 to 250 milligrams of this and attempt to dance, because that's probably not very safe, and that's
Mm-hmm.
probably not going to get me where I want to be, because I'm going to be on the floor, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah. So what I hear you saying is, you start to inject some responsibility and some awareness into how you are engaging these substances. So you're a young
Yeah.
person, you're discovering these substances, you're discovering what they might mean for you, what kind of experiences they can help you have, and then you're also learning, and this is really what makes sense for me and what doesn't make sense for me. It's interesting because we really don't have a structure for helping young people learn this. We just tell them, don't use it. That's how you can be responsible. Just don't use it. And we don't, there's sort of nothing in, there's nothing else outside of that.
Right. So like I guess it kind of gets into, whether we decriminalize or legalize things, and how do we inject that sort of information, because one one's solution doesn't necessarily cover that education. um
So actually, let's go there. I want to actually talk about, because, when we were doing prep for this, and again, I am fresh to this conversation, so it really has been helpful for me to understand these various aspects. So you talked about decriminalization, selective legalization, and regulation. I wish we had I wish I could like pull up a Zoom whiteboard and we could, draw a mind map and have you talk about, visually discuss this. But right now we're just going to have to use our words. So if we, help us understand, decriminalization and selective legalization and regulation, how do they relate? How are they different?
Yeah, so there's actually like um, two things I want to bring up real quick before diving into that.
Sure.
So what we're seeing right now, seeing a lot of right now, are people trying to um, legalize things or decriminalize things bit by bit because, like I said, the federal government, they're sitting on their hands as far as this particular topic goes. They're not interested in changing anything right now.
So we're seeing state
State by
laws,
state is a
city
way
by
to
city.
override, yeah, city by city. Each municipality basically has some ability to override federal law. It
Mm-hmm.
will get them in trouble sometimes, like when we saw California, which, you live in California, when they first legalized medical marijuana, they didn't just let dispensaries open all willy-nilly. They were sitting in federal folks. They were trying to, enforce the system. Even with alcohol, probably a lot of people my age don't know this, being
Wait, and
born in the 80s.
what is
I'm
your
30,
age?
I'm 33.
Okay,
So folks
33.
who were born in the 80s, basically after the legal drinking the legal age for drinking raised from 18 to 21.
Mhm.
That was, I believe, 1981. So a lot of people who were basically born in that time period or were too young in that time period to understand law, like drinking age, because they were not legal, may not have realized that you could, when you were 18, buy what they consider like light alcohol, like I think beer and wine.
Mhm.
18-year-olds could buy and consume it. Um, and it wasn't until, like, I believe 1981, when there were a lot of drunk driving incidents, that they decided to federally say, this is going to be the law now. Everyone needs to raise their drinking age to 21. I think there's like 2 states that still have like slightly different
Hmm.
legal, like, regulation around it. I don't know if it's all of Louisiana or just specifically New Orleans, but they will
I
allow.
gotta look this up.
Yeah, they will allow. I think you can, if you are with adult, you can technically consume alcohol, I think, in establishments. Like if you were around the presence of adults,
Mhm.
there are some places that allow you to do that. I think if you're at least on your property and supervised, like a lot of states were like, nah, we're not doing that. We want people to still be buying alcohol. That's like, maybe that bolsters their economy. But the main way that the federal government was able to get most states to just comply without resistance was saying, we're going to stop funding some of your public
Mm.
services. So like roads and things of that nature, things that would like cripple the
Mm.
infrastructure of a lot of places if they lost federal funding. So like,
Gotcha.
yeah,
Yeah.
fine, if you don't want to raise it to 21, like, maybe a parent that's just like, look, if you don't clean up your act, if you don't get good grades this semester, we're taking away your allowance and you can't play
Yeah.
your Xbox anymore. So
Yeah.
that's what the federal government did.
I actually just pulled this up. So Louisiana's drinking age was raised to 21 from 18 in 1986, even though the law changed, as you said, in the early 80s to avoid losing federal highway dollars. But a loophole made it legal for bars and others to sell alcohol to those under 21, which still sort of complicated enforcing the law. So they raised the drinking age, but you could still buy it. So you couldn't drink it, but you could buy it because that makes sense.
It's
So
the number of states did that. I mean, hey, it doesn't have to make sense. They get the
I
money and
know.
they get the taxes.
Yeah,
So
no,
it's
that's a good
like, yeah,
point.
you can
That's a good
buy
point.
it, but you can't drink it. Wink, wink.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, yeah.
sure.
Gotcha.
But there's lots of loopholes like that, and we're seeing a lot of that. I think right now we have about 35 states with some sort of like drug policy reform going on, which is a pretty big deal,
Mhm.
considering that just eight-ish years ago, like California was the only one that
Mm.
kind of had this going on. And like even just getting CBD was still kind of like it's questionable, just because they were trying to treat CBD like it's just weed, and it has psychoactive properties. But yeah, like state by state is another way that things are kind of like piecing together. But as you can see, like some people do what they want with it, and that to get everybody on the same page, it's going to take a lot more than every state like handling it however they feel like handling it.
Yeah, so even so I want to just kind of add, I think, kind of refine that point a bit. So even though it is definitely progress to have Santa Cruz and Oakland, Denver, or DC, like to have these individual places make decisions around decriminalizing these substances, the patchwork maybe doesn't necessarily hold if the federal government does decide to step in, which I think I did remember hearing or reading that the federal government, that there was some sort of explicit statement from the federal government that they would purposely not step in. Like at least like right now, like the federal government is going to purposely step back. But even then, it's still just creates like a lot of unevenness and a lot of unreliability around substances, is what I think I hear you saying.
Yeah, basically. And I think that they kind of had to step back because it's unconstitutional. States are allowed to do that.
Well, I mean, we end up in a tiff about it, and it goes to the Supreme Court.
Yeah, and I think that they would still be like, this is unconstitutional. So that was like a waste of everybody's time. But yeah, so basically we've got this patchwork going on. I mean, like, for example, like my brother lives in Boston. It's legal to buy cannabis recreationally in Massachusetts. And I'm not a heavy cannabis user, but I enjoy it. And I'm very particular about what I want. I want to know exactly the strain and how the effects are, the right type of topical rub or whatever. Like I'm very particular because otherwise there's no regulation on what I'm getting. I don't know if it's going to be a indica or sativa or even like a synthetic cannabinoid that isn't even actual weed, so I go up to Boston.
You could be using carpet fibers. You have no idea.
Right. I go up to Boston and just, I see my brother, my nieces, I grab me some nice recreational selection of regulated weed. And people are like, why would you do that? And I'm like, well, first of all, I like seeing my family. So second of all, like I get to go into a store and like have a conversation about my weed, just like I would have a conversation about like, what the soup of the day you recommend or something, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
It's good for me to know what I'm getting because I'm the kind of person who's very sensitive to weed. And if I smoke the wrong thing, I'm very uncomfortable. So I'm not going to trust Bobby on the corner or whatever, he'll tell me it's X, Y, or Z and it's A, B, and C, or he doesn't even know.
It could be because, we're very gender forward in some ways. It could be Regina on the corner, but it still doesn't matter.
Of course, Regina or Spot or whatever gender neutral, feminine, masculine name.
Exactly. You might still get some bad weed is the point. Like you
I'm
end
just
up
saying some.
And it is interesting because I do think that this is sort of the last area where we have just said, you just have to take your chances, right? Like, you should know what's in your food. You should know what's in your water. You get to know what's in your bourbon. You get to know what's in your Budweiser. But for this stuff, you just have to take your chances.
Right. And so like that legal regulation that we have in some places, it's beneficial, but like I have the privilege of being able to like move around to get to those places, whether it's DC or Massachusetts. They're close enough for me. I can do it. Not everyone can do it. Not everyone has the means for that or whatever. And also it's a little bit more expensive to get things from those dispensaries. So it's like, again, if someone only has $35 and they're trying to get their stuff, they're probably not going into a dispensary with that. They're not going to be able to get the same quantity.
I'm like it makes my eye hurt. The markup on my CBD oil right now that I use for joint inflammation, it's 4 ounces and I pay $130 for this right now.
Yeah.
But I pay $130 for it because I can go into a shop, ask an educated, experienced person who has a package that I am hoping is regulated, and that what's in that package is actually what's going in my body. So being able to sort of pay for the privilege of ingesting a substance that you can trust to some degree you're absolutely right. Like not everyone, I mean, just imagine if milk was $140 to make sure that you got good milk, right? Like
Right.
this is what we're working with right now.
Right. And I think that as it's a new system for us here in the US, but like we have all these different ways of basically like legislating this stuff. And another thing I've been seeing, especially with like ketamine, MDMA, like a lot of psychedelics, people are really pushing that medical edge because they know that um, if you can get something FDA approved, you're in the
Mhm.
door to
Yeah.
use this stuff.
Yeah.
But
Now
that
you've got
means
momentum. Now you've got
you've
momentum.
got momentum, but now that means you have to prove its medical value. It's very difficult to do that for a lot of things. And also, like alcohol has no medical value, like in
Mhm.
the grand scheme of like, you're not being prescribed a shot of whiskey for your back
There's a
aches or
lot of
something.
there's a
I mean,
lot of there's a lot of self-made medicating people getting through the pandemic who would
oh yeah,
disagree with
I'm
you,
not
girl.
I
Like,
I am not knocking how anyone gets through the day. I remember one time I had such like my body was so out of whack. I had some sort of viral thing going on that just amplified my pain so bad that I couldn't get out of bed. And they would not prescribe me opioids or something that would actually help me function. So I was taking shots of tequila with ibuprofen, like alternating ibuprofen and acetaminophen, like trying to not destroy my liver. But it
yeah,
was like, this is the best I can do because I
yeah,
don't like because naproxen is not gonna help.
yeah,
Like
yeah.
over the
It's that
counter
self.
painkillers are not strong enough, and they didn't want to give me an opioid. And so I was just like, I will combine all these things and hopefully not die and get through the week. So I'm not judging
Actually,
anybody. I'm saying like the government doesn't recognize it in a medical way, but we're
for
still allowed
sure.
to use it.
Yeah, for sure. And actually, to that point too, I can't let this point get away without calling this out. Because of the opioid crisis and the escalation in opioid abuse, we now have this pendulum swing of where it's like even it's more challenging to get an opioid prescription when you really need one, right? Because we are so concerned now with people abusing opioids. So now you're like trying, like, could you please just give me some opioids? Like, what do I have to do to prove that I will use these opioids responsibly? Please, for the love of God, give me some opioids. And
Right.
it can be very hard to get them now. So then now you have to go do this other whole sort of rigmarole of a regimen trying to, and fortunately, you managed to be okay with it. But what if you had miscalculated something?
Right. And
Yeah.
I feel, and I would not recommend that to anybody. I did it because it's like, well, I kind of understand how these things work, and I could
Yeah.
probably just to it's just so I could get up and get to the bathroom. I couldn't get to the bathroom. I was in so much pain,
Yeah.
make a meal, like just
Yeah.
so I could do the basic things of survival.
But you happen to
Um,
know enough about drugs
yeah,
because
I was
you've
doing
spent
my
a
best.
yeah, exactly. You've spent a lot of your adult life thinking very deeply and being very active about drugs. So, you could sort of do that, but that is not, again, we're talking about access here, right? That is not
Right. That is not
accessible.
functional. And I've
Yeah.
known people to die trying to figure out alternatives that they had access to,
Yeah. Yeah.
whether it was opioids or just something else. Like there
Yeah.
was even a whole case where someone was trying to use DMT for therapeutic purposes, and they were actually going to, I believe was it during the pandemic or it might have been before, but like the person who was going to do this um, experience with them. I don't know if they were actually a shaman. I'd have to like review the case again. But basically, they were going to video conference with the person who sent them the substances.
Yeah.
It was supposed to be DMT. The person thought it was DMT, but whatever, whoever they ordered it from or picked it up from, it was not DMT. It was something, I forget what it was, but basically, the person witnessed them overdose and die while video conferencing with
Wow.
them, and they were trying to use a substance for healing.
Yeah.
They weren't trying to even party. They weren't even like depressed and being like trying to off themselves. They were
Yeah.
like, stuff like that happens, and it's rare, but it happens. And it gets even more, the the level of danger increases when you're already dealing with substances like opioids, which can have their own deadly effects.
Yeah, for
It's
sure.
even DMT's probably not killing anybody, but like the fact that you can get something that you thought was DMT and it kills you is like terrifying.
Yeah.
Um,
And I think that actually, like, that sums up why you do this work, why you do the work of decriminalization, and why you're sort of, in this area. So we have to come back to this. Like, help me
yes, yes.
understand
We're
decriminalization.
coming back to decriminalization and legalization. I just want people to understand like this is where we are,
Yeah.
like with all this weird patchwork of different variations of laws, and we see how it's not working very well for
Yeah.
access. It's not really protecting people. You've got decriminalization options, you've got legalization options. And one of the legalization options is that FDA route, which I was just saying. Now you gotta like really dump a lot of money into research to prove that this is going to help cure something. And then you get down to patents. You can't patent something that's already technically been patented. I think MDMA was a Pfizer chemical, so they're technically using something ever so slightly tweaked differently. Um, that is close enough to MDMA that they're going to call it MDMA. And this is information I've gotten from folks dealing with the MDMA trials. Like they have it. I think they have like a 10-year
Yeah.
whatever on it.
It's a
They
10-year
have an
patent.
agreement.
Yeah.
Yeah, they have an
Yeah.
agreement to use it. Um,
Yeah.
but anyway, like that's very complicated, and you have to have a lot of money and resources to do that. And if you want cocaine to be legally available, I want cocaine to be legally available. What do we? How are we going to justify that for some people? They tried using cocaine back in the day, and they realized, ooh, maybe we shouldn't use cocaine for like toothpaste and
Yeah. You don't put it in everything,
in
right? Okay. So
Coca-Cola.
yeah.
So
So actually, yeah. Wait. So hold 1 second, because this is actually
okay.
very interesting. Because this is also something, like, again, for those of us who read Carl Hart's work, he talks about this quite a bit. So first of all, a question for you: why would anyone want cocaine to be legal? So why would you want cocaine to be legal, for example?
So this is literally getting into the decrim versus legal thing.
Exactly.
For example, I would want cocaine to be legal because cocaine is one of the most, if not the most, adulterated drug, period. Like there is so much crap that people put in cocaine or pass off as cocaine when pure cocaine is actually quite desirable and quite useful. Like it can be used in the same way that psychedelics in some cultures are used. It can have those therapeutic properties that people seek. What people don't know about cocaine is that it's what's called, ooh, let me not get too deep into that, but basically cocaine is in a category where it hits all your mood regulating receptors. So
Mhm.
that's your serotonin and dopamine and norepinephrine, which is
Mhm.
like it's related to adrenaline. So it's
Mhm.
hitting all these mood regulating receptors, which obviously is going to feel extremely pleasurable. So does ketamine. It does
Mhm.
it in a more unbalanced way, but it has the same action. So
Okay.
it's like an imbalanced version of the same thing that cocaine does. And we're all pretty much okay with ketamine at this point, especially since it's now FDA approved and people are like, oh my God, it can treat depression and
Yeah.
addiction and all these things. It's like, well,
So you're suggesting that the reason,
so then
so,
let's have access to good cocaine, because
yeah,
when we don't have access to good cocaine, like now people are saying there's fentanyl in it. I mean, maybe there is. I'm not saying there isn't. It's very difficult to prove.
yeah, but so
But
essentially what you're,
whatever's going on, lots of harm is coming from shitty cocaine.
yeah,
So
gotcha,
I would
gotcha.
want
So
that regulated. I'd rather
gotcha.
people have legal cocaine where you can, just like weed, walk into a store and be like, yeah, I want this brand of cocaine. I hear good things about this brand of cocaine,
Gotcha.
like in the
Gotcha.
70s or whatever, and you get your snazzy like elephant tusk. I
Hmm.
mean, not that I'm advocating poaching or anything, but back then it was like a luxury thing of like, ooh, I have this fancy accessory for sniffing my cocaine.
Yeah.
I'd
Gotcha.
rather people have access to that and know that their cocaine's not full of baby laxative and
Mm.
fentanyl or amphetamines or other things that just are going to have this dangerous, potentially more dangerous effect. Um,
Gotcha. So let me sum that up. So I'm hearing two things. Number one is that actually cocaine might have therapeutic use, but most of us don't know that because we've never been exposed to the notion that cocaine would have therapeutic use. What I know about cocaine is Scarface. So essentially, the notion that there would be some therapeutic or developmental reason why you would use cocaine is incredibly foreign, right? So that's the first thing, is you're like, wait a minute, we actually should rethink this. There's a possibility for cocaine to actually have some therapeutic helpful use. The second thing is, and because there is a good reason to believe that cocaine might have therapeutic use, you want to make sure that you're actually using cocaine and not some knockoff, you bought it in the back alley on Canal Street, God only knows what's in it, substance. You actually want the substance that would actually really help you therapeutically. So for you, you're saying legalize cocaine so that we can essentially regulate its production and make that production consistent, make the quality of it consistent, and people can use it therapeutically.
Yes, absolutely. And that's
Okay.
with legalization. So let's, kind of differentiate what's legalization versus, decriminalization.
Decriminalization and regulation.
Yeah.
So we
So
got
with
decrim, legalize, regulate.
right. So decriminalization is basically just saying we're removing criminal penalties from whatever they decide, possession, use, however they decide to set up the decriminalization um, um, kind of language. But basically, they're just saying, we're not going to send you to jail for X, Y, and Z. It doesn't mean that suddenly the drug market is now going to have pure substances, because the supply chain hasn't changed. It's just the penalties that the user may face has changed. Just like if you get a speeding ticket, you don't go to jail, you just have to pay that ticket. So a lot of times it's like fines, maybe some community service, like there's, some level of quantity that they will just be like, you shouldn't have this, but you don't go to jail, you get $100 fine or something.
Okay,
I think that's
okay,
how weed was for a while in New York.
okay. So hold on one second here. I have two questions off of that. So the first question is, does decriminalization typically focus primarily on the user of the substance and not the seller of the substance? Like, I live in Monterey County, and one of the most beautiful aspects about Monterey County is all of the woodland here. But it is also the case that, rangers will run up on, vast swaths of land that are being used to grow weed or grow substances. And those vast swaths of land are not owned by everyday people. They're owned by the cartel. And so it can be very dangerous to be a backpacker or a hiker deep in the woods here, because, there's still this sort of, there are still criminal elements engaged in these substances, even though these substances have been decriminalized. So that's been a little bit of confusion for me. So I'm curious, does decrim focus mostly on the user, not the seller? Like, how does that work actually?
Yeah, so that's actually a really good question and a really good kind of distinction, is that I have yet to see decriminalization focus on removing the criminal penalties from selling it. It's still illegal. They're just saying whatever they deem personal amounts is what is now not going to come with a potential jail or prison sentence. So basically, for example, I think I'm going to use like a legislation that's happening right now. Like decriminalization is not really fully a thing in New York. It's being worked on. But the original language of the decriminalization bill, which we're working to change, considered anything that was, I think, a Class B misdemeanor, like whatever the quantities were in the Class B misdemeanor and below, would be considered decriminalized for personal use. They would consider that personal use. And I think that was like, the amounts are usually really arbitrary, of like, X amount of grams of this or X amount of grams of that. And it's really weird. Sometimes it's still really discriminatory and arbitrary. However, we're trying to say, if we have this 911 Good Samaritan Law, which basically says, even if you have up to 8 ounces of drugs, which is a lot of any drug, or any amount of cannabis. So you could have, like, I don't know,
4 pounds.
If you have like let's say 4 pounds of cannabis in your vehicle, but someone is overdosing and needs medical attention, you can call 911, and those 4 pounds of weed, they're going to pretend like they didn't see it because they just want to deal with a medical emergency. So if you have up to 8 ounces of a bunch of drugs, you should still call 911 for this person, if that's yourself or someone else in your, in your midst that is experiencing a medical emergency, whether it's, especially if it's like drug related. They just want to be like, listen, don't be scared to call 911. You're protected up to this point. So I'm saying, at least I'm advocating for, if we have that law that's concerned about people's health and not concerned about the amount of drugs they're in possession of, we might as well decriminalize with the same criteria. If we're calling that personal use should be 8 ounces of all drugs and any amount of cannabis.
Gotcha.
If I can call 911 with that amount, then I should be able to carry that amount.
Gotcha. Okay.
But anyway, that's an example of decriminalization. Like, it's about the personal user. Selling it is still absolutely illegal, and you are not protected in any way. And if for some reason you have more than 8 ounces, if the law were to say that 8 ounces is personal use, if you have more than that, then it doesn't apply to you. Like, you are still, now it's like a class A felony, and you will then be charged in that category. So it has nothing to do with the sellers. I know a lot of people don't like they associate a lot of drug use with supporting, those criminal like cartels and things, but that's because it's still completely unregulated.
Yes, that's what I wanted to get to. That like decriminalization seems like it doesn't, it's a step and it's a small step.
Scratching the surface, basically.
Yeah, you still are, injecting some chaos and arbitrariness to to usage as well. One thing that I'll say here though, Joe Rogan, I've referred to this before too on the podcast. Joe Rogan talked with Carl Hart, I think for the first time in 2014. So if you go on Spotify, and I'll put this in the resources, the show notes here. You can see this conversation between Carl and Joe Rogan. You can see this one in full. And Joe Rogan said, that with decriminalization, it just seems like it just sort of sets us up for like a lot of aggravation, like tickets and fines and arbitrary application. And, Black and brown people are probably going to get harassed more than other people because that's the way things work in America. And Carl Hart had a very interesting response for this, at least at the time. This is one of the reasons why I want to talk to him, because I want to see if he still has this perspective or if he's changed his perspective over the years. But he said that at the time that America was too ignorant for drugs. We're just so uneducated and so sort of like inept with dealing with drugs that if we just legalized drugs, if we just skipped decriminalization and went to legalization, that every societal ill that would exist would be ultimately blamed on drugs, and then there'd be this backlash. So for him, he wanted to see the steps of decriminalize, then educate, then legalize. I wonder if you have that same perspective. Firstly, it's a long time from 2014 now. A lot has changed, but also, there's, I think maybe, generational differences as well. And, just with your own experience. So I just wonder what you think of that.
Yeah, so I definitely agree with him, both in the context of like we're as a society not really prepared for that. We're already seeing it to a degree. So for example, Portugal has decriminalized all drugs. Like that happened like 25 years ago or something now.
Wait, did they decrim or did they legalize them?
They decriminalized all of it.
Okay.
But they still have contaminated drug supply. They still have to have harm reduction agencies doing all of the work of like helping educate, because like nothing has changed but the fact that use is, not a criminal penalty to a certain degree. So, we we still have lots of things that would kind of work against harm reduction. Like even having a syringe exchange program is illegal in a lot of states or cities. So like even if we decriminalize everything right now, we're still not having the conversations we need to have to help destigmatize and educate people around safer drug use, awareness to these things. Like I said, like someone they weren't aware that they could get DMT that wasn't DMT. Things
That
like
could
that
kill you.
happen. And
That
that's
that could
literally
that could
my
kill you.
role in a lot of the work that I've done is being a harm reduction educator. But like people are super resistant to that because they feel like it's promoting or condoning drug use. There's still this moral thing. So even if we decriminalize everything, that doesn't change people's opinions all of a sudden.
Yeah.
Gay marriage was legalized like what, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, and people are still like, like the gays shouldn't be allowed to marry. Like that doesn't change shit. So,
Yeah.
we've got to be able to do both. And like decriminalization, like I said, scratching the surface. At least we're not putting more people in prison over that shit.
Yeah.
That doesn't, I think with some decriminalization, some places are saying, okay, we're also going to release people who are in prison for the things we now decriminalized and give them their rights back. That's
And
not
expunge
happening in enough. Yeah,
yeah,
expungement.
expunge their
That's
records.
not
Yeah.
happening enough, which is kind of why it kind of pisses me off. Because we should know by now who's the most impacted by those policies.
Yeah.
So just being like, okay, cool, from here forth, this isn't an issue. Yet there's, I don't know, millions, most likely, of people sitting in jail while other people get to like now openly do this.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so I think that it's interesting because the question then becomes, well, why decriminalize, right? If we're going to have all this aggravation, if cartels can still, make it dangerous to be in the woods, if we're if we still will have unreliable and potentially dangerous supply, why decriminalize? And it does sound like one of the biggest reasons to decriminalize is around equity in relation to drugs. Like we should actually like free people from these prison records that they have, get them off parole. I certainly have people in my family who have done time for drug offenses. They're just in the wrong place at the wrong time in terms of, they're in states that aren't interested in decriminalizing, and they're watching this flourishing economy in states elsewhere that they can't touch or tap into because they're on parole and can't leave the state that they got busted for using drugs in or selling drugs in. So it is interesting because it does sound like decriminalization has its utility in that it could at least sort of lower the burden that's being borne in the so-called war on drugs. And then it also could be that first step toward, especially if you couple decrim with education, it could be that first step toward changing or evolving people's perspectives around drugs.
Yes, so that's exactly why decriminalization is really just like a first step, and shouldn't be like the only action. It's also, I would say, the most accessible, as far as like um, getting your foot in the door legislative wise. It's easier to be like, hey, just stop putting people in jail over this versus like, let's now sell this in stores or like
Gotcha.
allow people to sell this at all. Um, like that's a harder sell, especially since some people really do believe that certain drugs are really bad. And a lot of the people who are in favor of decriminalizing it are still like more in the mindset of like people need help. We should like be focusing more like less on like punishing these people and like maybe redirecting funds to like public services, whether it's like, I don't know, program like maintenance programs or educational programs, whatever, like helping people in
Yeah.
some way.
So
um
essentially defund drug laws,
yes.
right? And then
And I think
redirect that money.
slowly,
Yeah.
yeah, and then slowly that kind of helps gain a little bit more public um acceptance, because they're now able to see that things aren't getting worse just because people aren't being thrown in jail over possessing and using substances. And now, like even in Portugal, where it's been decrimmed for like 25 years, they're seeing like lower drug use, like use of problematic drug use. They're seeing lower rates of crime and all this stuff. Like they're seeing very good results from just not directing so much energy and resources into just throwing people in jail for this. And then what? They get out, and because they've been stripped of many rights, they can't even get a job. They can't. So what are
Yeah.
they going to probably
It
do?
just,
Go
yeah,
back to
just
selling
create,
drugs,
exactly. It just
or
creates
get
all
on
these add-on.
drugs because they're now like, well, life is kind of screwed up for me. I don't know what else I'm going to do. So
Yeah.
I
It
think
just
it's that
creates
first
it.
step.
Exactly. It just like the criminalization, like we know it, I essentially what I hear is we know criminalization doesn't fix it really and makes it exponentially worse. So let's at least try decriminalization. At least let's not make it worse.
Right.
Yeah.
And with that happening, it's like now you have the opportunity to have more open conversations about educating. Because right now, like I said, I do a lot of this harm reduction education, and a lot of my stuff, a lot of my work revolved around doing so in kind of more social, recreational spaces. And people don't even want to have those conversations because they're like, oh my God, this might be seen as me condoning or promoting drug use in my space.
Yeah.
Even if they're like totally aware that drugs are being used, they don't even want to pretend to like they even acknowledge that or anything, because they might be punished for it. They might be fined, have their whatever, because that's considered illegal
Yeah.
here.
Yeah.
So, at least decriminalizing it, that has to happen first so that having these conversations feels safe. People don't want to talk about illegal drugs
Yeah.
because it's illegal. And that, like a lot of people don't understand how surveillance tends to work sometimes. So people are just like, they don't know if they're like, if they're texting someone about this information, that now they're going to have their phones tapped or something. People are
Absolutely.
very paranoid about
The
that, and
yeah.
rightfully so in some cases, because like you've got Facebook and Google and all these platforms that have these messaging services that your data is not always private.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. So
so
yeah, so just taking away the criminality so that I just like there's just one less thing to worry about. So now we can actually focus on let's have a useful conversation about drugs.
yeah, then it becomes
Yeah.
acceptable.
Yeah.
Well, maybe not acceptable to some people, but then it just becomes
It becomes
accessible.
possible. It
It
just
becomes,
becomes a
yes,
little bit more, a
possible.
little bit more possible. So we're coming to the end of our time, and I have a couple more things I want to ask you really quickly. Just a couple more pieces of conversation I want to have with you before we close. Here's the thing. So we haven't touched on it. I'm not going to go into great detail about this. I'll put some information in the show notes, and I'm sure you have some statistics too about how people of color, BIPOC people, we bear the brunt of the casualties in the war on drugs. So there's obvious clarity why Black and brown people should care about decriminalization. But why should if you're a white dad in suburban St. Louis, why should you care about decriminalization? For example, like if you're not sort of in the group that has really had to suffer from this, why should you care about decriminalization? And in fact, like these laws are protecting me, they're keeping my community safe, why should I want to decriminalize?
Well, they're not actually keeping their community safe. That's a facade for sure, because I'm sure a lot of these people in the suburban areas have kids that end up using these substances and are in, find themselves needing help around it because of whatever factors. So you're not being protected just because these things are illegal. That's a misnomer. They think that they might think that, oh, anyone who's using this is just a criminal and they're a bad person. They're probably going to rape and kill and steal or whatever, which
Pillage
is
and
just,
plunder and yeah.
yeah, which is like stigma that had been perpetuated by the government. None of those things are true. But when suddenly it's their son Timmy who's got an opioid problem, they're like, oh my God, we need like everybody needs to carry an naloxone now, and everybody needs to help them, get them into recovery, support them, because it doesn't, like, white folks use substances just as much as their Black counterparts. There's statistics around that. I think Carl Hart also talks about that as well. So
Yeah.
that's a provable fact. Y'all are using drugs. If you're a white person in suburbia, your neighbors are using drugs. People are using everyone should be allowed to use drugs.
Yeah.
Period. And I didn't quite get the touch on it, but I can, like, kind of give some things for people to mull over. The differences between regulation and legalization. Like,
Oh yeah, no. Let's do that. Let's actually talk
okay,
about that a little bit. Yeah, let's
let
do
me
that.
just quickly say that, for example, like something that's familiar to a lot of people are, so the FDA, regulates things
Mhm.
from a legal standpoint of, like, medical stuff. And also, like, food packaging and things of that nature.
Mhm.
That FDA exists because people were dying from, like, shitty food,
Mhm.
like back in the
Mhm.
day.
God
And
only,
so,
God only knows what was in your food.
oh, like, it would be like mercury, arsenic,
Yeah.
whatever. They were
That's
like,
why you have, to pray over it. Mohawk,
yeah.
you got to pray over everything you eat. Stuff. In my family, you better pray over what you eat.
Yeah.
You don't know what's in that
But
food.
that was because it was completely unregulated. And then they were like,
Yeah.
we should regulate this a little bit because there's no reason for this. You
Yeah.
could, whatever. But, like, for example, they don't really regulate, like, supplements.
Mhm.
But there's still things that are required. You can't just put a supplement and be like, this will cure everything.
Yeah. You have to have a
Or
little statement.
there's
Little,
got to be statements, like, that's
Yeah.
regulation, like a statement of, like, there might be some pricing regulation, there might be tax regulation, you might have to disclose ingredients. The packaging has to be consistent with, if it's like corrosive or something, you got to say it's corrosive.
Mhm.
Basically those are different types of regulation, even though the FDA is like, we're not going to try to, we don't care about testing this to see if this is going to kill somebody. Just make sure you label your package this way,
Yeah.
or and don't make ridiculous claims. So that's a type of regulation which we see happening in different ways. Whereas when it's legalized, now there's like a much more of a structure around it, kind of like with alcohol.
Mhm.
Because with alcohol, like, without any form of, like, legal regulation, something a little bit more, uh I guess, sort of like, they make sure that you're able to consume safe enough, safe alcohol that's
Mhm.
not going to make you go blind or die like they did during Prohibition, and that you have to be 21 to purchase and consume it for
Yeah.
the most
Yeah.
part. But it's legal to do that.
So it's a
As long as you meet
so
those requirements, it's legal to sell it. As long as you do all these things, it's legal to purchase it. As long as you meet this criteria, and that is the standard across, all alcohol production.
got it. So it sounds like there's a combination. If we think of alcohol as an example, there's a combination of legalization and regulation that comes together with alcohol, right?
Yeah,
That
because now you can
there's
open a business around alcohol.
yeah.
Especially like there's different requirements for if you're selling beer, wine, or liquor, or all three, or just two, or it's dine in versus carry out. There's all this regulation around it because it's this legal system that is sanctioned by the government, and they get their taxes off of it.
Got it. Okay. All right. Got it. So that's kind of that parsing out between decriminalization, which is so the removal of certain penalty, legalization, which is the allowance of engagement, sale, etc., and then regulation, which is sort of the rules around what you talk how you can talk about your product, or how you package your product, or how you price your product, or what goes into your product.
Yeah, basically.
All right. So I have a question for you then around, so we are in March 2021, for future reference. And California has just introduced a bill related to psychedelics. I think it's to decriminalize psychedelics. Actually, I think I need to look up the detail here, because I don't remember now if it's to decriminalize psychedelics or to legalize psychedelics for medical use. I'm not exactly sure what the bill is, but I know that there's been some announcement made recently. I'm curious what you think about this. Like, what can we expect, and sort of like how long the journey takes for this? What may or may not change as a result? Is this really something to celebrate, or do you look at it with a little bit more caution? What are your thoughts?
I'm definitely a person that looks at these types of progress with caution, and I do want to acknowledge it as progress because it's better than where we're at. I just think we're not. I just don't think um, I don't think we're demanding enough. Like I said, all this piecemeal stuff, all these different ways. We're like trying to use this broken system to get the things that we want, and it's like only benefiting certain people. It's not, if it's not expunging criminal records and all this stuff, like we're still losing.
Gotcha. So, and I just pulled this up. So, new California bill would decriminalize psychedelics and expunge criminal records.
Okay, but who's really been criminalized heavily over psychedelics? I mean, like, not saying that people have not gone to jail for it, but like,
Yeah.
that's not really where the focus is. It tends to be on the things like cocaine, methamphetamine, opioids, even cannabis when, when it's still illegal in those municipalities. So it's just like, I mean, yay for people who want to seek healing with psychedelics and aren't already in jail or something over it. Like, I think that that's good, but also I feel like even before, even when when the focus was more on cannabis before it became psychedelics, this medical distinction is highly troubling for me because it just starts to create a different type of stigma, of us trying to appeal to this, like, it has medical benefits, and
So
like,
if you're not using it medically, then you're using it wrong.
yeah, either you're using it wrong, or if it still doesn't have medical use that's provable, then you're not supposed to be using it. Like, I want people to be able to enjoy whatever the hell they want to enjoy. Like, it can, like, literally, I want you to be able to have legal cocaine. I want you to be able to have legal opium, all those things, because
And you don't think society will go to hell in a handbasket if we've got legal cocaine and legal opiates? You don't think so? Like, I
I
want to
want
give you
everybody.
I want to give you
I
the final word
just
on this.
just look up Uruguay. They have
Okay.
never regulated substances, and tell me where the societal decline is in Uruguay. They're
Yeah.
also the first place to fully regulate for adult use cannabis in 2013. I want to see where the decline is. We were also considering cocaine, and they might still get there. So, because for them, Uruguay is like sandwiched between like Brazil and I think Chile, like somewhere like they want to basically just be like, we don't want cartels running the show here. Like, that's dangerous for people. We want people to just do the stuff, and if they're doing the stuff, why not us benefit? Like, that's kind of that was another thing I meant to say about the people in suburbia. Like, you are paying taxes to have law enforcement waste their time with this type of petty crap. So if it's not protecting you, then why are you wasting money on it? So if we could basically just say, like alcohol or even tobacco, anybody who wants to use this, you pay this money and the government gets some taxes. Maybe that will fund our schools better. Maybe that will give us some good roads and healthcare. Like, if we're like, where are we going to find the money to give people free healthcare? Maybe sell people drugs. Just a
Interesting.
suggestion.
This is really interesting. Where are we going
Like,
to find the money to give
taxes,
people good health care?
taxes.
Sell people drugs.
Let people do drugs and stop wasting it on throwing them in jail, and then like it doesn't even stop people from doing drugs.
Yeah. Interesting.
We've wasted billions of dollars on the drug war. So if you're a Republican and that makes you in like wasting money and heavy government involvement makes you furious, well, you should be furious that we're wasting all this money on law enforcement to do something that isn't helping anybody.
Yeah. So essentially, if you're for small government and fiscal responsibility, they need to get in touch with you and start working with you on decriminalization.
Libertarians and folks, just leave people alone. Let them do drugs. Maybe you're not for the legalization of it, but at least decrim.
Yeah, gotcha. All right. Mohawk, it has been really interesting to talk to you for sure. You've given me a lot to think about. And hopefully you've given folks a lot to think about especially with regard to access to psychedelics, because essentially decriminalization is about leave people be and let them heal. And, if and whatever that looks like, whether that healing is from psychedelics or that healing is from drugs that we wouldn't normally think about, like cocaine, leave people be and let them heal. And I think that's certainly an important message for access. Thank you so much for being here. I actually look forward to talking with you again. I want to see where this is at in 3 years, for example, right? And maybe we come back and have another conversation. What do you think?
Yeah, let's see what's going on. 3 years, I might have abandoned the United States. I'm going where the drugs are at. We'll see. Let's hope that that doesn't have to happen, But tired. I should be allowed to do drugs. I'm in my mid-30s. Come on, let's go.
All right, I hear you, girl. I hear you. All right, well, let's get to it. Keep doing the good work, and let's see where it gets us. Until next time.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. That wraps up another episode of Keys to the Kingdom. Thanks so much for listening. Check out the show notes for resources we discussed, and follow the Keys conversation on Twitter at Psychedelics Key. Until we meet again, remember, you are connected, you are love, and the kingdom is yours.